Good evening and welcome to this Remembrance Day edition of APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. Ottawa was just one of the places in the country where Indigenous veterans were honored this week. The annual event acknowledges the contributions First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples have made to Canada's armed forces, while at the same time recognizing these contributions have often gone unnoticed by the Canadian government and underappreciated by Canadians. Veterans, politicians and onlookers gathered at the National Aboriginal Veterans Monument in Confederation Park. Smudging ceremonies and the laying of wreaths were just some of the activities that took place.
We must never forget. We must never forget those men and women who sacrificed their lives yesterday. For indeed today we have the freedom, and our children of 7 generations continue to have those freedoms. In the same way that we acknowledge the ancestors, we acknowledge our veterans.
We also want to acknowledge the injustice faced by Indigenous people, by Métis, Inuit, and First Nations. The fact that many who served our country, in their service, came home to have lost their status. That's an injustice that we have to acknowledge and we have to remedy.
Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Mark Miller is commemorating Indigenous Veterans Day, saying their service to our country should never be overlooked.
It shouldn't be lost in people's minds how veterans were treated, that Indigenous veterans were treated. They served in disproportionate amounts, ready to lay down their lives. It destroyed families as a result of those deaths, and they weren't treated well when they got back compared to non-Indigenous veterans. So that day is dedicated to them and to their memories, as well as we honor their service and need to continue to honor their service.
Miller says reconciliation with First Nations will be a top priority for the government in the new sitting of Parliament. An Indigenous Veterans Day ceremony also took place in Winnipeg to honor Manitoba and Canadian veterans. Michelle Karlenzig was there.
A small group came to honor Indigenous veterans this morning in Winnipeg. The event was live-streamed from Thunderbird House due to COVID-19 safety. Melvin SWAN is a retired Canadian Armed Forces member from Dog Creek. He survived residential schools, day schools, and the 60 Scoop.
Well, I think it's about peace and understanding and respect. As a soldier, I had no choice. As a Anishinaabe Hogitsita, a warrior, I have a choice to walk with peace, understanding, and healing, and to show the world what that Thunderbird spirit is all about.
SWAN won a case against the Canadian Armed Forces for racism in 1994. Many spoke at today's ceremony, including ROBERT-FALCON OUELETTE, a retired Canadian Navy officer turned politician.
We all have families, we all have communities, and they are so important to us, and they are the reasons that we get up in the morning. They're the reasons that we serve.
As ceremonies were held across the country honoring Indigenous veterans, SWAN says things have come a long way.
I remember when it first started here in Manitoba with George Mann, I was there with him struggling through the times and the nature of Aboriginal veterans. I think they're more appreciated today when it comes to that. An Aboriginal Veterans Day should mean a whole lot more in this country in regards to lives we have lost, whether it's day school, residential school, or the poisonings of our land. So a lot has to happen, and it's going to take many generations to get there.
Michelle Karlenzig, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Indigenous veterans were honored at a smaller in-person gathering this week in Vancouver. APTN's Tina House was there and has this story.
It's a solemn day as veterans, their families, leaders, and community members gather at the cenotaph and laid wreaths to honor those that served in the armed forces. Timothy Cardinal is here to honor his late dad, Donald, a World War II vet originally from the Onion Lake Cree Nation. His dad was 17 when he enlisted, and he passed away at the age of 90. Timothy says his dad didn't talk much about the war, but he says it was traumatizing for him.
He was one of the foot soldiers that hit the beaches of France, Normandy, so he was the survivor of that.
And for many of those soldiers, they were young, far from home, and entering a war zone that's almost hard to comprehend unless you were there. According to the Government of Canada, 1/3 of First Nations people enlisted. Although Métis and Inuit people also enlisted, First Nations people with Indian status were the only ones to be officially recorded by the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Veteran Mike DANGELI also enlisted at the age of 17, and for the next 10 years, he proudly served with the U.S. Airborne Rangers for 4 tours. Today, he's here with his wife and son. He says, as an Indigenous veteran, he faced a lot of discrimination.
Or in 2000, when I came to the September 11th event, and I tried to line up with fellow veterans, I was treated like crap by non-Indigenous people. And I was really grateful when they started this, because I felt this weird, even though I was so proud to have served and done my part for my country, being told I wasn't good enough to be a part of it, and so that hurt.
And Vancouver Mayor Kennedy Stewart had a special announcement.
I, Kennedy Stewart, Mayor of the City of Vancouver, do hereby proclaim November 8th, 2021 as National Indigenous Veterans Day in the City of Vancouver.
And on this National Day to remember Indigenous veterans, we will never forget their sacrifices for this country and our freedom. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
A member of the Penticton Indian Reserve in British Columbia is representing the Canadian Army in the Remembrance Day ceremony. APTN's Chris Stewart has this story.
Corporal Justin George has been a member of the Canadian Army for over a decade. He followed his grandfather's path, who fought in World War II and is now stationed in Edmonton. Now, George has been selected to represent the Army at the Remembrance Day ceremony in Ottawa. The Remembrance Day Century program picks 6 members to represent the military and RCMP. Corporal George has been in Ottawa preparing for his role.
I will be standing sentry at the National War Museum Memorial. I'll be performing drill and, yes, just standing guard.
He says he is proud to be here.
It's an incredible honor, and I'm humbled for this opportunity to be able to remember our fallen here in our in our nation's capital. It's incredible representation showing the Indigenous members of our Canadian Armed Forces. It's diversity.
And he says being part of the ceremony as an Indigenous person is important.
It's important to me because I feel I have a duty to represent Indigenous peoples and be that role model for the youth. I felt I've had that duty for a long time now. So this is an opportunity for me to, put that in play.
He told APTN that support back home has been incredible.
Everybody's so proud. The city of Penticton, where I grew up, and my community, the Penticton Indian Reserve, has shown unbelievable support. Everyone's just so happy back home.
Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
We want to hear what you think about Indigenous Veterans Day and Remembrance Day events this year. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca or leave a comment on aptnnews.ca. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Follow APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. All right, we need to take a short break, but still to come. A Manitoba man is being remembered today by his great-grandson for his kindness towards Indigenous soldiers during World War I.
He was a decent human being who respected Canada's Indigenous people when not very many people did.
Welcome back. A Manitoba man is being remembered today by his great-grandson for his kindness towards Indigenous soldiers during World War I. Here's Sarah Connors with that story.
He might not be in the First World War history books, but to Glen Campbell, his great-grandfather and namesake, is a hero.
He was a lifelong advocate for Canada's Aboriginal people.
Campbell's great-grandfather, Glen Campbell, was the commanding officer of the 107th Timberwolf Battalion in the First World War. Based in Winnipeg, it's estimated around 500 of the 860 men in the battalion were Indigenous. Though Campbell wasn't Indigenous himself, his great-grandson says he wanted to lead a fully Indigenous battalion.
He just thought they were outstanding people who weren't treated very well.
Campbell lived in Manitoba but was born in Fort Pelly, Saskatchewan, where he grew up playing with First Nations children. He was also fluent in Cree and Ojibwe and married the daughter of a chief. His great-grandson says this helped spark his kind treatment of Indigenous soldiers, which was unusual for the time.
He had a personal relationship with so many of his men, including his First Nation soldiers. They just had a lot of respect for Glen, and Glen had a lot of respect for them.
Originally trained as an infantry battalion, the 107th was reconfigured as an engineer battalion. However, the 107th did see some action in battles like Hill 70, where they experienced heavy losses.
I know Glen took every loss personally because he had such a close personal relationship with so many men in his battalion.
Campbell died in 1917 from natural causes while in France. The 107th disbanded in 1918 and was dispersed throughout other battalions. While many might not know Campbell's name, his great-grandson says he's proud of him nonetheless.
He was a decent human being who respected Canada's Indigenous people when not very many people did.
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
Now to north of 60, where a unique program to honor Indigenous veterans is underway. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs takes a look at progress being made, one headstone at a time.
It's a way to honor sacrifices made by Indigenous veterans in the Northwest Territories.
Joe Powder was born in Campbell, Portage, Saskatchewan. His gentle nature, love of people, and
Edna Powder of Fort Smith is here to remember her cousin, Joseph Xavier Powder, who left his community to serve in World War II.
I think the Indigenous people were not treated well. They were not given the money that the others were. You know, they didn't support them even though they were in the Army.
This time last year, there was only an unmarked cross in this Yellowknife cemetery. But that changed with the help of Floyd Powder, a veteran and a researcher with the Last Post Fund, a national charity helping identify Indigenous veterans.
And I'm really happy about this because this stone will be here for ages.
Also in attendance, CATHY, who answered the call for information regarding Joseph Powder.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy,
for identifying.
Yes, thank you very much.
She remembered him from canoe trips in an area where he was known to take people out hunting and trapping.
And he started to tell stories, and he had some wonderful stories of his time with the military.
This year, a total of 11 headstones have been provided by the Last Post Fund in Yellowknife, Bechecal, Fort Simpson, Hay River, and Fort Smith.
Well, I think that the headstone says it all, lest we forget. I think we do forget the sacrifice that people have made and the contribution.
For the Powder family, the recognition has been a long time coming.
Joe had a lot of relatives, a lot of sisters and brothers, so I'm sure Dorothy, when she comes, she'll be really happy to see this.
With the current COVID-19 outbreak, ceremonies have been postponed, but are scheduled to resume June 2022. Charlotte Moore-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
It's time for one more break, but still ahead. One Mi'kmaq artist designs her own poppies to include Mi'kmaq culture.
I put my own spin on them. I added quills because I did that in reference of Mi'kmaq cultures.
Welcome back. As Canada remembers our fallen heroes, what has become one of the most visible symbols of Remembrance Day is marking a special anniversary. This year will mark 100 years that the poppy has been used as a symbol of the horrible costs and sacrifices of war. The idea of using the bright red flower to honor veterans came from Madame Anna Guerin of France. She was inspired by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae's haunting poem In Flanders Fields. The Great War Veterans Association, the precursor to the Royal Canadian Legion, officially adopted the poppy in 1921. And speaking of the poppy worn to honor veterans turning 100 this year, some have an Indigenous touch. They can be beaded or made with sealskin. One Mi'kmaq artist designs her own poppies to include Mi'kmaq culture. Angel Moore brings us this story.
Cheyenne Isaac-GLOADE of Listugush First Nation has been beading for 20 years. A multimedia artist, she designs regalia, quillwork, and basketry.
I'm definitely big into taking our traditional concepts of Mi'kmaq art and putting them into modern art and my art going forward.
For the last 5 years, Isaac-GLOADE beads poppies with a Mi'kmaq twist to honor Mi'kmaq veterans.
And I put my own spin on them. I added quills because I did that in reference of Mi'kmaq culture, so we use a lot of quills, and yeah, I decided to put my own twist on my poppies. Although I still do beaded ones as well. I think I'm a little bit known for the quill ones.
The porcupine quills, dyed red and cut at the ends, are threaded into the poppy. Isaac-GLOADE uses them to honor Mi'kmaq veterans. The poppy has been a symbol of remembrance since the First World War.
So I think it was so important that, you know, as a Mi'kmaq artist, I'd represent Mi'kmaq culture through poppies, as well as be able to, you know, wear these amazing, you know, beaded or quilled poppies that represent something a lot more meaningful.
The poppies can cost up to $80, but Isaac-GLOADE gives 25% of the sale to the veterans.
Because I don't want to solely capitalize off of, you know, veterans and all of, you know, their sacrifices, so I always make sure to give back, as I do with all of my art.
Angel Moore, APTN National News, Tubuktuk, also known as Halifax.
He's one of Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldiers, but for the longest time little was known about Tommy Prince and his contributions to Canada's efforts during World War II and the Korean War. It's a gap that's slowly been mended over the past decade, and the Government of Canada formally added to Prince's story with a special ceremony. Brittany Hobson brings us this from our archive.
Nearly 8 decades after Tommy Prince first volunteered to fight for Canada, a special ceremony was held in his honor. Hundreds came together at Lower Fort Garry to crown Prince one of Manitoba's hometown heroes.
We recommit ourselves to sharing this land and to the values and principles that he and his comrades in arms defeated. I have to believe your memory boxes will be filled, and you will have more questions, and you will be grateful for this amazing service of these people and of our amazing land.
The ceremony was part of the Parks Canada program, which recognizes people who made significant contributions to the wartime effort. The accolades were heaped on. Robert-FALCON announced the Government of Canada has designated Prince as a person of national historic significance.
It is an enduring recognition that Mr. Prince had a significant impact on the history of our nation. And for those who are gathered here today, he is truly a hometown hero.
Prince was born in 1915 in Petersfield, Manitoba. In 1940, he volunteered to fight in the Second World War. In 1951, he contributed his services in the Battle of Capion during the Korean War. During his time serving, Prince received a number of awards and medals, including the Silver Star and the Military Medal. King George VI presented him with both honors during a ceremony at Buckingham Palace in 1945. Once Prince returned home, life was not easy.
Experience came with a heavy toll, a toll that today's veterans often face.
And then following that honorable discharge, he finds himself back here in Manitoba, living through also what we've heard, discrimination, poverty, and inequity.
Prince spent the later years of his life living on the streets in Winnipeg. He died in 1977. Some of Prince's children were on hand for the ceremony. In a short but passionate speech, Tommy Prince Jr. urged all levels of government to commit to helping veterans.
It bothers me deeply that I have to stand here and say this. But we got to do something for our heroes. Not only of the Second World War, First World War, but for the wars that they are fighting today.
Prince Jr. works with Homes for Heroes, an organization that builds tiny homes for veterans. He hopes to one day see something like this in Winnipeg. The day was an eye-opener for one of Prince's daughters. Karen BRAUN-PRINCE never knew her father, but hearing stories of his accomplishments gave her a glimpse into who he was.
He is a great inspiration to many Aboriginal people and First Nations people, and especially to me. What a legacy to live up to.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
In honor of all veterans past, present, and future, Tom Eagle, who enlisted in the Army when he was 19 years old and went up in rank as NATO peacekeeper in Germany and Cyprus, reads the Veterans Prayer as we watch some of the sights from the Meningate World War Memorial in Ypres, Belgium.
It's the veteran, not the preacher, who has given us the freedom of religion. It's the veteran, not the reporter, who has given us the freedom of the press. It's the veteran, not the poet, that gives us the freedom of speech. It's the veteran, not the campus organizer, that has given us the freedom to assemble. It's the veteran, not the lawyer, that give us the right to a fair trial. It's the veteran, not the politician, who give us the right to vote. It's the veteran that stands for the flag. It's the veteran that salutes the flag for what he has done for this country.
All right, that's going to do it for this Remembrance Day edition of APTN National News. Thank you to all those who served in the past, those who continue to serve today, and those who will serve in the future. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great night.
When the sun set over the world, I'll be thinking of you. I know you are far away. No matter where you are, I still love you just the same. Hey,